In today's episode, we're out here taking a look at the all-new 2018 Hyundai Elantra GT. This is also known in other world markets as the Hyundai i30. You can think of the Elantra GT as the hatchback version of the Elantra sedan, although there are some key differences between the Elantra sedan and the Elantra hatchback. In some ways, the Elantra hatchback is slightly more premium, which makes sense because of the way the hatchback version is treated in other world markets. The first thing you'll notice when you look at the Elantra GT is that the overall styling is not the same as the Elantra sedan. In terms of overall styling design, this actually shares a bit more with the new Sonata sedan. So we see Hyundai's latest grille up front with some 3D elements going on there, fairly large Hyundai logo. The standard headlamps in the GT are halogen projector headlamps, but our model does have the optional full LED headlamp modules. We have daytime running lamps below, and then functional grilles on each side of the front. One thing we don't see up front is a radar sensor because we do not have Hyundai's latest suite of active safety systems available in the GT. You have to step up to the GT Sport in order to get that at this time. Although the i30 seems like a fairly large vehicle if you live in Europe, in the United States the Elantra GT hatchback is considered a compact hatchback. At 170.9 inches long, this is actually 9 inches shorter than the Elantra sedan. The shorter length versus the sedan is pretty typical in America because this is a hatchback Elantra, not a wagon Elantra, and that's generally the difference between hatchbacks and wagons, is that the hatchback version of a vehicle will stop just after the rear tires, whereas the wagon version of a particular vehicle will generally be about the same length as the sedan, but have this same box extend further backwards. That means that this is just about the same length overall as the Corolla IM, although this is about 7 inches shorter than the Honda Civic hatchback, which is quite long for this segment. That's mainly because the Honda Civic hatchback has that very sloping rear end. It actually has perhaps more of a liftback or Prius-like shape than a traditional squared-off hatchback like this. The squared-off hatch design is very space-efficient and very practical, and that's why we see about the same kind of cargo room in this as we see in the Civic hatchback, even though it is about 7 inches longer. An interesting touch that you will notice looking at the side of the vehicle is that all models come with 225 width tires. If you get the Elantra GT, which is what we're driving right here, then they are 17-inch wheels and tires. If you get the Elantra GT Sport, then we get 18-inch wheels and tires, but they're still 225 section width. The wider tires that we find on the Elantra GT make a noticeable difference when it comes to overall grip versus base versions of the Elantra sedan, which definitely have narrower tires. Moving to the rear, our model has the optional LED tail lamps. Really just the base trims will have the incandescent bulbs. Most models will have the LEDs that we're seeing right here. As you'd expect, the rear end changes a little bit between the Elantra GT and the Elantra Sport. Now in this video we will be talking mainly about the Elantra GT with the 2-liter engine. If you want to know more about the Sport, then stay tuned, we will have a separate video on that later. If you live outside the United States, the i30 is available with a variety of different gasoline and diesel engines. But in the United States, the Elantra GT comes with just 2 gasoline engines. Things start out with this 2-liter 4-cylinder engine that we've been driving this week. It produces 161 horsepower and 150 pound-feet of torque. It is mated to either a 6-speed manual transmission only in the base trim or a 6-speed automatic, which is what we've been driving. If you opt for the Elantra GT Sport, then we get a 1.6-liter turbocharged engine that we see in a variety of different Hyundai models that produces 201 horsepower and 195 pound-feet of torque. That engine is also available with a 6-speed manual transmission or a 7-speed dual-clutch transmission that we again also see in a few other Hyundai products. Interestingly enough, the 1.6-liter turbocharged engine gives us the highest and lowest fuel economy overall in the Elantra GT. If you choose the 1.6-liter turbo and the 6-speed manual, you'll get 25 miles per gallon average, but if you get the dual-clutch transmission, then you end up at 28 miles per gallon average, just slightly above what we're driving right here. It is worth noting that the overall fuel economy in the Elantra GT still falls below some of the more efficient competition. You will definitely find better fuel economy, for instance, in the Honda Civic hatchback, which will average about 7 miles per gallon better than what we're driving here. When it comes to front seat comfort, I'm going to give this model 9 out of 10 points. We are driving the top-end GT trim with a power driver seat and 2-way adjustable lumbar support. It is worth noting that we do find slightly more adjustable seats in some of the competition, most notably models that have a 4-way adjustable lumbar support. We do have a tilt telescopic steering column with a large range of motion, and overall the seat design is very comfortable for my body shape. As we see in many vehicles in the compact category, the passenger seat remains a manual seat in all versions of the Elantra GT. Rear seat comfort also comes in at 9 out of 10 points. We have 77 inches of combined legroom in the Elantra GT, which is very good for a compact hatchback, although it is just a little bit below the Chevy Cruze or the Honda Civic hatch. Headroom is also fairly generous for a compact vehicle in America. Generally speaking, one of the reasons you'd want to buy a hatch in this size category is because the roofline is overall more square than the average compact sedan. At 6 feet tall, sitting right here behind myself, I definitely have enough legroom for a longer car trip. I have about an inch left. But if you routinely have taller folks up in the front of the vehicle, you will notice that there is obviously less room back here than your average mid-size sedan like a Hyundai Sonata. I can't actually move completely to the right because this front seat is all the way back in its tracks and there just isn't enough room for my legs. Scooting over to the middle seat, headroom is generous because of the overall shape of the vehicle, even though this seat is a little bit higher off the ground than the outboard seating positions. Now keep in mind the model that we're driving does have the optional 2-pane panoramic moonroof, which goes almost to the back of my head, and that does reduce headroom overall. Practicality and cargo efficiency are obviously one of the big reasons to buy the hatchback version versus the sedan version of the Elantra. When you open the hatch, we find 24.9 cubic feet of cargo space back here, which puts this very similar to your average compact crossover rather than the average compact sedan. As I said before, this is actually 7 inches shorter overall than the Honda Civic, but because of the very square design that we find in the Elantra GT, we don't really find that much less cargo space than the Honda Civic. It actually is just 1 cubic foot less than the Honda model. And even though this is 1 cubic foot less than the Honda, the cargo area is actually more practical because it is definitely squarer than what we find in the Civic. Because this cargo area is actually about 25% larger than a Corolla IM's, 22-inch roller bags like this, which is the largest size you can carry onto a domestic flight, can easily be stacked across the back in this upright position, and you can close the hatch. Although this tonneau cover does not close quite right, so you would have to remove it ideally if you wanted to put the maximum cargo right back here. Taking a closer look, you'll notice that the cargo area is a decent amount lower than the seat backs. That means that you cannot push luggage right there onto the rear seat backs. You do have to lift them up a little bit, but it means that we have overall more cargo room back here. If we lift up the cargo area load floor, we actually find even more room down here, enough room for a full-size spare tire if you wanted to upgrade to one aftermarket, although our model does come with a compact spare tire. As we look around the interior, keep in mind that we are in a top-end trim of the Elantra GT, not the Sport trim, so we do have this large panoramic moonroof and a few features that you won't find, of course, in the base model. On either side of the front cabin, we have height-adjustable seat belts. We also have two-way adjustable headrests, and the model that we're driving has the optional leather upholstery. The leather is perforated in this very attractive crosshatch pattern because these seats are both heated and ventilated. Taking a closer look at the seat bottom cushion, we have some complementary piping, and again, more of that perforation in that same sort of crosshatch pattern. As we see in most compact vehicles, the front doors are made from a combination of hard and soft plastics. We have soft plastics for the upper section of the door, both the charcoal section and this ivory insert, and then harder plastics around the bottom of the door panel. Because the Elantra GT is a compact vehicle, and you notice this front seat moves further backward than that door opening, they've cut out this B-pillar right here a little bit to act as part of an armrest. Taking a look at the lower door panel, we find a very, very generous storage cubby right down here that's definitely larger than the average in this segment. On the passenger side, we find a bin-style glove compartment that is quite large, definitely easily able to accommodate large tablet computers. Like the doors, the dashboard features a two-tone design. We have a soft-touch upper injection molded section and then a hard-touch injection molded section that matches what's going on the door, and then darker plastics below that. Moving to the center of the dashboard, we have a large color touchscreen infotainment system with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto that is standard in all models of the Elantra GT, which is a little bit unusual. The screen is mounted on the dashboard, somewhat reminiscent of the Mazda 3. This helps give the dashboard a lower and less bulky look, while still giving you a screen that's a little bit higher to your line of vision as you're driving the vehicle down the road. We have some physical buttons on each side: radio, media, track forward, backward, volume over here, of course, and the power knob. And then if you opt for the factory navigation system, which is available, we have a map and nav button on the right side. It's worth noting, of course, that by giving us Apple CarPlay and Android Auto standard, all models of the Elantra GT effectively have navigation straight from the factory as long as you have a compatible smartphone. You'll find the SD card for the mapping database right here below the screen, alongside the knobs to close and open these center air vents and the hazard light button. Continuing down the dashboard, we find the controls for the optional dual-zone automatic climate control, and then a storage cubby where we find a single USB input, auxiliary input, and 12-volt power port. The storage cubby is large enough to easily accommodate larger smartphones like my iPhone 7 Plus and still close the lid. Depending on the trim level, you'll also find a Qi wireless charging mat inside the storage compartment. In the center console, we find a fairly traditional automatic transmission shifter. We pull over to the left for the manual mode, push away from the driver for gear change up, pull towards the driver for gear change down. On either side of this, we find the controls for the heated and ventilated front seats, and then a drive mode button to change between sport and normal mode. Between the front seats, we find either a manual handbrake or this optional electric parking brake. We also have auto brake hold. This keeps pressure on the brakes so you don't have to keep your foot on the brake pedal at stoplights. And then there's a roller cover covering two very large cup holders. The armrest slides forward and backward to adjust to drivers of different sizes. And if we lift it up, we find a moderately sized storage compartment with a 12-volt power port, and I have a wallet inside there for reference. The instrument cluster is clean and attractive with white needles, black faces, and white numbers. We have a color multifunction display between the speedometer and the tachometer. This display is where we find things like our typical trip computer readouts. There are also turn-by-turn directions if you have the factory navigation. Tire pressure readouts and certain vehicle settings are adjusted via this display as well. The steering wheel is one of Hyundai's newer 4-spoke designs. We have these large side spokes that run from side to side across this prominent airbag in the middle, giving this more of a 2-spoke theme. And then we have these smaller spokes at the bottom that meet in the middle. Our steering wheel is, of course, leather wrapped, and we have some small sport grips up top. We find the buttons for the infotainment system over here on the left, along with dedicated phone hang-up and pickup buttons. And then on the right of the steering wheel, we find the cruise control buttons, and then the buttons and toggle that control that multifunction display between the speedometer and the tachometer. In our acceleration tests, the Elantra GT ran from 0 to 60 in just over 8 seconds, which means this is about a half second faster than a Corolla IM, although it is notably slower than the Honda Civic because the Honda Civic hatchback gets a standard turbocharged engine. Now obviously if you step up to the Elantra GT Sport with its 1.6-liter turbo engine, then this will go from 0 to 60 notably faster than the model that we're driving, and that puts it in more direct competition to the turbocharged version of the Honda Civic. The way, of course, that this vehicle accelerates is a little bit different than the Civic or the Corolla IM because we have a traditional 6-speed automatic transmission in this version and, of course, the 7-speed dual-clutch transmission available in the Elantra Sport. The 6-speed automatic paired with the 2-liter engine is pretty average, but the 7-speed dual-clutch transmission paired with the 1.6-liter turbo is one of my favorite transmissions. Now, some people dislike the way dual-clutch transmissions feel because it is going to feel more like driving a manual transmission than a traditional automatic. There is the possibility of a little bit of clutch shudder, the vehicle can roll backwards on inclines, but the way that transmission shifts and the way the overall vehicle is programmed really is exactly to my tastes, and it's definitely more engaging than a continuously variable transmission, which we do see in an awful lot of entries in America. In our 60 to 0 braking test, we ran from 60 miles an hour back to 0 in 120 feet, which is fairly good for a compact vehicle. That's thanks to the standard brakes that we find in this vehicle and, of course, the standard 225 with tires, which do help reduce the braking distance. Now, obviously, the tires that we have on the Elantra GT Standard are not ultra-grippy summer tires, so if you were interested in stopping faster, all you'd have to do is swap these tires out for something that has a little bit more grip. Doing so would also improve your handling, but of course you would sacrifice just a little bit of fuel economy. When it comes to our overall handling score, I'm going to give the model we're driving a B-. That's due to a variety of different factors. First thing and most important thing to remember is that this segment is getting quite competitive. So we have excellent entries like the Mazda 3 hatchback and the brand new Honda Civic hatchback, which are absolutely excellent handling vehicles, especially the brand new Honda Civic. So if the Honda Civic gets an A and the Mazda 3 gets perhaps an A-, then the rest of the models in this category are going to have to slot below. A surprising entry in terms of handling in this segment is the Corolla IM, and that's thanks to its standard double wishbone independent suspension in the rear. It's a very elegant suspension design, and it really makes a big difference when it comes to handling in that vehicle. It has a very, very settled feel to it. And we don't find quite that level of polish in the base Elantra GT because this does not have an independent suspension in the back. Now, if you get the Elantra GT Sport, then things are quite different because it does get an independent suspension in the rear, and it removes the slight unsettled feeling that we find in this model on broken pavement in the corners. So if you really start pushing this car harder when the road starts winding, you are going to notice a difference between this and the Elantra Sport. Now, don't take that handling score to mean that the Elantra GT handles poorly. Quite the opposite. In fact, this will outhandle most versions of the Elantra sedan that you'll find out on the dealer lot. It's just that the compact hatchback category is getting really competitive lately in America. Out here on this rougher gravel road, the Elantra GT does an excellent job at soaking up large and small bumps. Although like many compact vehicles in America, the suspension is definitely firmer, I think, than the sedan counterpart. So if you want a slightly more supple ride, you might want to look at the Elantra sedan. That all seems to go with the slightly sportier character that we find in the Elantra GT versus the sedan counterpart. The lack of a fully independent rear suspension does affect the overall ride quality of the Elantra, just like it affects the handling a little bit out on the road. Depending on the situation, the rear suspension in the Elantra can feel just a little bit upset over broken pavement, especially if you're really starting to push this car harder. Back out here on a paved road, the suspension does an excellent job at soaking up bumps on various different pavement surfaces. This doesn't really have a problem with washboard pavement as some small vehicles do. This doesn't feel upset or unsettled, and we don't get that kind of bobblehead feel that we find in some small cars. In our cabin noise test at 50 miles an hour, this vehicle scored 71.5 decibels, making this one of the quieter entries in this compact hatchback category. Fuel economy has been an area where Hyundai has lagged the competition, and the Elantra GT really isn't changing that too much for 2018. Over a week of mixed driving in this particular model, we've been averaging 26 to 26.5 miles per gallon, which is a little bit better than the EPA says we should be getting in this vehicle. However, you should know that the Honda Civic will give you better fuel economy in just about every version. That's thanks as much to its 1.5-liter turbocharged engine as the continuously variable transmission. The continuously variable transmission is also one of the reasons that we find better fuel economy in the Corolla IM. Although, again, CVTs are not as engaging as a traditional automatic transmission or the 7-speed dual clutch that's available in the Elantra GT. Now, interestingly enough, if you want better fuel economy in the Elantra hatch, then you can get it by upgrading to the more powerful 1.6-liter turbocharged engine. Thanks to the 7-speed dual clutch transmission, it will average about 1 to 2 miles per gallon better than what we're driving right here. The compact hatchback category in America is a pretty interesting one, because this category is full of models that were really intended for Europe primarily. That's true not only for the Elantra GT, also again known as the Hyundai i30 in other markets, especially Europe, but also for the Corolla hatchback, which is actually manufactured in Europe, and of course the Corolla IM. In general terms, that's also true of the Ford Focus hatchback, and that's of course before we even begin discussing things like the Volkswagen Golf hatchback, which is an actual European hatch. Logically then, this vehicle would be a great option for you if you're looking for something that's a little bit more engaging, a little bit sportier feeling out on the road than your average compact sedan in America. And of course, if you're looking for a Goldilocks just right kind of vehicle that has an excellent blend of cargo practicality and on-road vehicle driving dynamics without being too hardcore out on the road, this is going to be an excellent option for you as well. The new Elantra GT starts at $19,350 in America, and that would be for the base model with the manual transmission. If you want the automatic transmission, you simply add $1,000. In addition to the standard 225 with tires and 17-inch alloy wheels, all Elantra GT models also come standard with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto and the large infotainment screen that we saw on the dashboard. Moving over to the Elantra GT Sport, that starts at $23,250. Again, the automatic transmission is $1,000 extra, and you'll notice that we have a decent amount more standard equipment in the GT Sport, including that independent rear suspension that really makes a difference in the way the vehicle feels out on the road. Now let's move over to the key takeaways. Obviously the design is very fresh because this is one of the newest compact hatchbacks in America. It also is more traditionally shaped versus something like the Honda Civic, which actually has a more Prius-like side profile. As we've come to expect from Hyundai, there's a decent amount of standard equipment in the base model, and if we move on up to the Elantra GT Sport, we get even more standard equipment, making it a very compelling option. Adding additional value to the Elantra GT is the long standard warranty that we see in all models. To get a warranty this long in some of the competition, you could pay up to $1,000 extra when you buy the car, so it is important to keep that value proposition in mind. Now on the downside, we don't have standard active safety systems like we do find, for instance, in the Toyota Corolla IM. Although not standard, you'll also find those same active safety systems available for a slightly lower price tag over on the Honda. The Elantra GT we were driving this week did have the base engine, and that base engine is a little weak compared to, of course, the Elantra GT Sport, or even the base engine that we find in the Honda Civic hatchback, because Honda puts their 1.5-liter turbo standard in that model. And that means that when it comes to base acceleration, the Elantra GT is definitely behind that particular model. Now that said, the optional 7-speed dual clutch transmission and optional 1.6-liter turbo engine are an excellent combination in the Elantra GT. Some people dislike the way that the 7-speed dual clutch transmission shifts, however, I actually think it's an asset to the Elantra. The shifts are fast and they're definitely crisp. Now, it won't feel like a traditional automatic because it's not a traditional automatic. Remember that it is a robotically shifted manual transmission, so it will feel more like a manual transmission with someone that's pretty good on the shifter. The last takeaway here is that we have somewhat average pricing and average value going on in the Elantra GT. The Elantra GT is no longer the bargain basement entry in this segment, so you will have to pay for the additional refinement that we see in this version of the Elantra GT versus previous generations. Obviously, our first competitor has to be the all-new Honda Civic hatchback. The Civic hatch was obviously designed for the European market, and interestingly enough, it's actually built in Europe, not in the United States, alongside the other Civic variants. In an unusual twist, Honda has decided to make the Civic hatchback not just the more practical Civic, but also the sportier Civic. And that's why the turbocharged engine is standard in the Civic hatch. Honda has also been incredibly aggressive with the price tag on this model, starting it at $20,850 for the model with the automatic transmission. That is really very, very close to the Hyundai Elantra's automatic price point, although again we have that standard turbocharged engine. You'll also find Honda's latest active safety systems available in lower priced models than we see in the Elantra GT. At this end of the price spectrum, the Honda Civic hatchback is definitely going to be faster than the Elantra GT, and it also is going to handle better than the Elantra. The suspension system design that we see in the Civic really is what helps it out when it comes to handling, and it is a pretty big difference when you drive the two back to back on the road. Now, when you start adding features and options to your Civic hatchback, it will get a little bit more expensive than a comparably equipped Elantra GT. So if you're taking a look at fully loaded versions, then the Elantra GT may start to look like a better option. It's also worth noting that the Civic uses a continuously variable transmission, not a traditional automatic or dual clutch transmission. So the 7-speed dual clutch that we find in the Elantra GT Sport is definitely going to be more engaging than what we see in the Honda. And I think that the Honda is overall a little bit too eccentrically styled for my tastes. Next up, we have the recently refreshed Mazda 3. Mazda decided to give their compact sedan and compact hatchback a bit of a facelift for 2017, but it is important to remember that the basics of the vehicle are several years older. Driving dynamics are obviously the big selling point with the Mazda. They've had a long reputation for making very engaging vehicles that are definitely affordable for the average shopper. But it's important to remember that with Mazda, it's a little bit more about handling feel than absolute grip. So if you want to go around a corner faster, you may actually go around a corner faster in certain versions of the Elantra GT, namely the Sport, than the Mazda 3. Thanks to the refreshed cabin, the Mazda 3 has brought itself up to just about where we see the current generation Elantra GT. And interestingly enough, the two interiors are very similarly styled, although I think the Elantra GT overall feels a little bit fresher, a little bit more modern. One thing that we still don't see in the Mazda 3 at this time is an available turbocharged engine, and that is a pretty big difference when we take a look at the Elantra GT Sport versus, for instance, the 2.5-liter engine available in the Mazda 3. Next up, we have the Toyota Corolla IM. The Corolla IM started its life, of course, as the Scion IM. But going even further back, it's actually one of Toyota's European-focused hatchbacks, and that's why it looks different inside and outside versus the Corolla sedan, because it's not quite a hatchback version of that same Corolla. Although there are, of course, some similarities, and the drivetrain is basically the same. Because people seem to confuse the Corolla sedan and the Corolla IM just a little bit too much, there are a few key differences you need to keep in mind. The Corolla IM has a completely different rear suspension design. It is definitely much more sporty than what we find in the Corolla. Also, because the IM started out as a Scion model, not a Toyota model, they've decided to keep its pricing structure in place. So there are really no standalone options to choose from. You just get either the automatic one or the manual transmission model. There's also a difference between the sedan and the hatchback when it comes to the standard active safety systems. We do find autonomous braking, lane keeping warning, etc. in the Corolla IM, but we don't find radar adaptive cruise control in that model like we do in the Corolla sedan. That's because, again, these are not exactly the same vehicle. Now, those active safety systems are one of the big differences between the Corolla IM and the Elantra GT, because those safety systems are standard in the Corolla IM, and you'll find them, of course, at lower price points than comparably equipped Elantra GT models. But if you're looking to add features and options or a little bit of extra power to your Corolla IM, you just can't, because again, it only comes that one way. So you'll never be able to add leather upholstery, you'll never be able to add some of the other gadgets and goodies and Apple CarPlay, that sort of thing, to that model that you can get in the Elantra GT. Lastly, we have kind of the oddball comparison, which would be the Kia Soul Exclaim. Now, I say oddball because the Soul Exclaim is actually a subcompact hatchback, not a compact hatchback. However, because the Soul is so boxy, you actually can fit about the same kind of luggage in the back if you really tried that you can in your average compact hatchback. Now the Elantra will fit a little bit more, but it's really not that big of a difference. This comparison is also interesting because the Soul Exclaim and the Elantra GT Sport actually use the same engine and transmission. However, the rest of the Soul is quite different. The Soul is actually a little bit more closely related to the Hyundai Veloster than the Hyundai Elantra, and that's why we don't find an independent rear suspension even in the sporty trim of the Soul. Although the Soul is actually shorter, it manages to be heavier than the Elantra GT. It's about 200 pounds heavier or so. So it is going to be a little slower 0 to 60 if you compare the Exclaim to the sport version of the Elantra. But because of the overall size and shape of the Soul, it actually is going to be a little bit more comfortable for taller folks. We have more headroom inside, and the legroom figures are actually very, very competitive because of the overall squareness of the Soul. Even though the Soul is a little bit older than the Elantra, it also has done a good job of staying up to date, so the interior actually still feels quite fresh. The Soul really is the poster child of hatchback practicality. Because it is so square in the back, you can fit an awful lot of cargo back there, and actually, depending on the dimensions of your cargo, there's certain things that will fit in the Soul that may not fit in the Elantra GT. But it is still a smaller vehicle overall. Again, it's a subcompact vehicle, and so therefore it should be no surprise that it's going to be less expensive than a comparably equipped Elantra GT. However, it's also not going to handle as well. Not only because the Soul is a relatively tall box, but also again because of that lack of independent rear suspension. And the overall suspension design is not quite as elegant as what we see in the Elantra. Overall, the Elantra GT is a solid buy in this segment. It's proved itself to be a very reliable companion. The Sport model definitely gives you a little bit of extra zip and a little bit of extra fun if that's what you're looking for, and it's a very classically styled hatchback. Styling really is the only major knock in my book against the Honda Civic hatchback. However, all of the other aspects of the Honda Civic really keep it in top place for me in this particular segment. But I do have to give the runner-up status to the Elantra, specifically the Elantra GT Sport. I think the base model is just a little bit too slow in my opinion. I really would spend the extra money to get the Elantra GT Sport. And the Sport is not a bad value because it's really not that much more expensive than the average version of the Elantra GT. Of course, if you're looking for the best value in this segment, then look no further than the Corolla IM. The Corolla IM has excellent handling and a very, very good value proposition. Unfortunately, you just can't add the kind of options and gadgets that we find in the alternatives in this segment, and it's always going to be fairly slow. Thanks for taking the time to check out this video. Again, I'm Alex Dykes. Be sure and hit that subscribe button down there at the bottom of your screen. Go ahead and find us over at facebook.com/AlexNautos. And if you want to support this channel, and I hope you do, head over to patreon.com and find us over there as well. I'll see you next week.